The Crimean War was fought between the Russian Empire and the combined forces of Britain, France and the Ottoman Empire between 1854 and 1856. The three allies sent an expeditionary force, including 26,000 from the British Army, to the Crimean Peninsula in the Black Sea, part of the Russian Empire at the time, to lay siege to the Russian naval base at Sevastopol. The British army that went to the Crimea suffered from poor leadership and outdated thinking. The British hadn't fought a European war since Waterloo 40 years beforehand. The Commander-in-Chief, Lord Raglan, was a case in point. Now aged 65, he'd spent most of his 50-year career in desk jobs, including serving his great hero, the Duke of Wellington. In fact, in all that time in his career, he'd never actually commanded anything larger than a battalion. And now here he was, in charge of an army of 26,000. Having landed on the west coast of the Crimean Peninsula, the three allies, and they were later joined by a fourth ally, the Kingdom of Sardinia, made their way down the coast towards the main Russian naval base at Sevastopol. The Russians under General Menshikov tried to block them at the River Alma, but in the ensuing battle, they were defeated, suffering heavy casualties. Thanks to a sort of cumbersome Allied follow-up, it took 4 days for them to finally move forward. Menshikov was able to fall back on Sevastopol, where he then divided his forces, leaving Vice Admiral Kornilov to hold the port, while he took the army out of Sevastopol, marching east into the interior of the Crimean Peninsula. The Allies were now able to complete their advance on Sevastopol unopposed, but rather than attempting to storm the defences, they decided to lay siege to the naval base. Well, siege is an interesting term because it conjures up like an army surrounding the whole of Sevastopol. What actually happened was that the Allies positioned themselves to the south of the port, from where they bombarded it and anything approaching from either land or sea. So, a siege in all intents and purposes. The French positioned themselves on the left-hand side of the siege lines, being supplied by the port at Kamiesh, whilst the British chose to be supplied by the port of Balaclava, about 10 miles southeast of Sevastopol, and on the very far right of the British lines. From Balaclava, the Woronzof Road led from the port through a valley and onwards to the high plateau where the British forces were overlooking Sevastopol. And it was along this road that all the supplies to Lord Raglan's army had to travel. Raglan was fully aware that whilst his army was concentrating on strangling the Russian naval base, General Menshikov was menacing him from inland in the Crimean Peninsula. When, and it surely was a when, not if, the Russians attacked, the blow would fall on his end of the Allied lines, which made that supply road highly vulnerable. To protect this supply route through the valley, the Allies constructed 6 redoubts, or forts, on the causeway heights, which separated the two valleys, the North and the South Valley. And they were garrisoned by Turkish troops, supported by British cannon. It was now a month since his bloody battle at Alma, and finally, General Menshikov was being reinforced. General Pavel Liprandi arrived from the Danube theatre of the war with the 12th Infantry Division. Liprandi was of Spanish-Italian descent. Aged 58, he had a reputation as a reformer in the Russian army, and a general who actually cared about his soldiers' welfare, something that not all Russian generals at that time were particularly well known for. And it was to Liprandi that Menshikov entrusted the Russian strike back against the Allies. At dawn on the 25th of October 1854, the Russians attacked. Their aim was to storm the redoubts, protecting the British supply road, and then sweep across the valley to their south and seize the lightly defended Balaclava itself. Cut off from their supplies, the British would then be at their mercy. The battle that morning would break into 4 parts. The first phase of the battle was the Russian assault on the redoubts. The Russian plan was simple. Take out redoubt number 1 on the far right, and then roll up along the rest of the redoubts. The Ottoman garrison in redoubt number 1 fought like tigers against overwhelming Russian artillery and infantry attack. Only 100 of the 500 men escaped unscathed. That's a casualty rate of 80%. Finally, lacking any support, what remained of them retreated. The garrisons in the neighbouring redoubts, who were now coming under attack themselves, saw the plight of redoubt number 1 and joined the general retreat. The British gunners had no option but to spike their guns and join the flight too. Raglan, watching events from up on the plateau 650 feet above the valleys, ordered the 2nd and 4th Divisions to march down to support the beleaguered British forces. Both divisions made painfully slow progress that morning carrying out his command, and they actually took no part in the fighting. By 8 o'clock in the morning, redoubts 2 and 3 had fallen to the Russians as well, and the way was now clear for them to sweep on to Balaclava port. Over the hill came 3,000 Russian cavalry with their infantry and artillery lumbering up some distance behind. All that stood in their way were the British cavalry, consisting of the light and heavy brigades, about 1,500 men in total, and about 500 men from the 93rd Regiment of Foot, along with small detachments from the Marines and also some of those Ottomans who had fled the redoubts. The Russian force, in total, consisted of over 25,000 men, including those 3,000 cavalry. And down in the valley, facing them, were the 93rd Regiment of Foot. The 93rd comprised of men from the Scottish Highlands, raised back in 1799 on behalf of the Countess of Sutherland, in the very far north of Scotland. They were ultimately, through amalgamation, to become the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, one of the great fighting regiments of the British Army. Even by the Crimean War, they had a reputation of being highly disciplined, professional, courageous fighters. Indeed, they fought so bravely at the Battle of New Orleans back in 1814 that despite being defeated, the American defenders actually cheered them when they withdrew. And they'd already been in action at the Battle of Alma, storming the Russian positions as part of the Highland Brigade under the command of Major General Sir Colin Campbell. Campbell had enlisted during the Napoleonic Wars and had seen service in the Peninsular Campaign under Wellington in Spain, and since then in the Opium Wars in China. Now in his 50s, like Pavel Liprandi, and just like the Russian, this Scotsman was highly popular with his men. The rest of the Highlands Brigade, the 42nd, which was the Royal Highland, and the 79th, the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders, were up on the heights overlooking Sevastopol. And now it was just the 93rd, all alone, against the advancing Russian cavalry. They were fortunate to have Campbell with them that morning. And they were also fortunate to be supported by a small battery of nearby guns manned by Marines, and the remnants of those Ottoman troops who I mentioned earlier who had fled the Russian attacks on the redoubts. And finally, about 100 walking wounded from a nearby field hospital were being shunted up towards to join them. The Russian artillery had started to shell Campbell's men, and the Peninsular War veteran ordered them to lie down behind a mound, making them actually invisible to the Russian cavalry when they came over the hill. Now about 4 squadrons, about 400 to 500 cavalry, were ordered forward by the Russians to head towards Balaclava. It was now, as that Russian cavalry advanced towards the British supply port, that Campbell ordered his men to get up and move in front of the mound. It was about 9:15 a.m. It seems that sometime around now the Ottomans took one look at the Russians on their horses and fled towards Balaclava, possibly letting off a volley at long range towards them. Campbell had such contempt for the Russian cavalry, he decided to throw away the rule book. Standard procedure for infantry to receive a mounted attack was to form a square about 4 deep. Instead, he ordered his men to simply form 2 extended lines. It was a risky and unorthodox move. And as they faced the massed ranks of the Russian cavalry, Campbell rode along in front of his men, uttering the immortal words, "There's no retreat here, men. You must die where you stand." And the Highlanders shouted back their agreement. In fact, the Highlanders were so up for the fight that despite being on foot, some started to move forward with their fixed bayonets towards their mounted opponents. Campbell had to call them back into line, shouting, "93rd, damn all that eagerness!" Instead, he ordered them to fire a volley with their new mini rifles. The Patron 1851 mini percussion rifle musket was a marked improvement on the old trusted Brown Bess muskets, being far more accurate and also having a much more effective range. If the Russians were faced by some crazy kilt-wearing Highlanders looking like they were going to charge them with bayonets on foot, they were equally disconcerted by that opening volley of fire. Wheeling to their left, they tried to charge into the 93rd's right flank, and that's always the problem when you don't form a square. However, by wheeling, they also exposed their own flank to the Highland infantry. 2 more volleys were fired by 550 rifles. A private in the 93rd by the name of Cameron recalled that it seemed like a wall of fire in front of our muzzles of our rifles. Over 1,000 conical-shaped lead bullets smashed into the tightly packed Russian cavalry. Despite being nearly 200 yards away, the carnage wrought by that rifle fire and the stubbornness verging on contempt that the Highlanders were showing was enough to give the Russians second thoughts. The fact that Campbell had formed two lines rather than a square was also disconcerting for the Russians. For them, there was only one reason the Highlanders would perform such an unorthodox tactic. It was because there were a lot more Highlanders waiting behind that mound for them. And if these small group of men could inflict serious casualties on them, what on earth was in store behind the mound? The Russian cavalry turned away, licking their wounds. The 93rd, who had lost not a single man, killed or wounded, ceased fire and broke into wild cheers. The engagement had lasted less than 15 minutes. Observing this unorthodox and courageous encounter, two lines of British redcoats facing down the might of a cavalry attack, journalist William Howard Russell wrote, "The Russians dashed towards that thin red streak, tipped with steel." He soon changed his report from a thin red streak to a thin red line, and a legend had been born. The Russians returned to the main body of their cavalry, and now the third phase of this Battle of Balaclava took place. At 9:30 a.m, 3,000 Russian cavalry were charged by 800 men of the British Heavy Brigade under General Sir James Scarlett. The charge of the Heavy Brigade was remarkable for several reasons. For a start, it wasn't really a charge at all. The Russians on the slopes had actually come to a full stop. They were possibly trying to extend their lines in preparation for a downhill charge, or maybe they couldn't quite believe what was actually happening. The British force, a quarter of their size, was trotting, not charging, up the slope towards them. Sir James Scarlett, commanding the Heavy Brigade, was 55 and he had almost no combat experience. Whilst he lacked combat experience, he certainly didn't lack courage. He literally led from the front, almost 30 yards in front, joined by his ADC, Lieutenant Elliot, his trumpeter and his orderly. And into the surprised Russian cavalry the four of them rode, swiftly followed by the 6th Inniskillen Dragoons and the Scots Greys. But they were dwarfed by the Russian masses, who absorbed them and started to encircle them. As the Russians closed around Scarlett's tiny force, they themselves were now hit by the 4th and 5th Dragoon Guards, charging into their wings, swiftly followed by the 1st Royal Dragoons. Rather like their encounter with the 93rd Regiment under Campbell, the Russian cavalry was shocked at the suddenness, the recklessness and the courage of this attack. The massed ranks of the Russian cavalry broke and started to gallop back up the hill away from the British. The charge of the Heavy Brigade had lasted not much more than 10 minutes, and they had sustained about 92 casualties, only of which 9 were dead. Amongst the wounded was their commander, Sir James Scarlett, and his ADC, Lieutenant Elliot. Scarlett had received 5 sabre wounds and a dent to his helmet. Elliot had to be treated for an incredible 14 wounds, the most serious of which was a sabre cut across the back of his head. It was now that the Light Brigade could enter history. As the panicking and demoralised Russian cavalry retreated, they presented their flank to the Light Brigade to finish them off and claim a famous British victory. Cardigan, in charge of the Light Brigade, sat on his horse and watched impassively as the enemy fled right under his nose. One of his commanders, Captain Morris of the 17th Lancers, who had combat experience gained in the First Sikh War in India, was incredulous. He urged Cardigan to move. The noble refused. "What an opportunity we've missed," Morris lamented. But Cardigan, of course, was to find his own place in history in less than 2 hours' time. Up on the heights, British commander Lord Raglan had a bird's eye view of the whole battle, unlike, in fairness, his commanders like Cardigan down on the ground. And watching with satisfaction the retreat of the Russian cavalry from the South Valley, he was now made aware that the Russians were attempting to remove the abandoned British guns at the redoubt forts. Raglan was aware that his great idol, the Duke of Wellington, had never lost a cannon to the enemy in his whole career. Those guns had to be saved at all costs. He sent a note to Lord Lucan, the overall commander of the British cavalry in charge of the Light Brigade and the Heavy Brigade. The message said, "Lord Raglan wishes the cavalry to advance rapidly to the front. Follow the enemy and try to prevent the enemy carrying away the guns. A cavalry officer, Captain Nolan, rushed the note to Lucan. Lucan had already earned the nickname Lord Look-on, having failed to order his cavalry to press home the advantage at the recent Battle of Alma. Lucan read the order from his superior and was perplexed. "Attack, sir? Attack what? What guns, sir?" Nolan swept his arm behind him. "There, my lord, is your enemy. There are your guns." That wild theatrical sweep of his arm pointed not towards the causeway heights, but towards the end of the valley, where rather than the British guns being simply towed away, were Russian guns lined up facing directly towards him. Somewhat surprised, Lucan didn't seek any further clarification from Nolan or indeed Raglan, and he rode over to order Lord Cardigan to advance with the Light Brigade. Cardigan too was surprised to look down the valley at their supposed target, but he too merely accepted Raglan's orders without question. The final phase of the Battle of Balaclava was one of the greatest blunders in military history, the charge of the Light Brigade. I've made a separate video specifically about the charge of the Light Brigade. In fact, there's going to be a link at the end of this video, so I don't want to go into loads of the detail for you now. Suffice to say that Cardigan led his 600-strong Light Brigade all the way down that heavily defended Valley of Death, being fired on from 3 different sides, including a full frontal artillery barrage. They actually reached the Russian guns, and then, having got through them, facing the Russian cavalry behind them, they retreated all the way back down the valley, being fired upon again to where they'd started. The charge of the Light Brigade had lasted 25 minutes. Out of 673 men, 113 had been killed and 134 wounded. 475 horses were killed or had to be put down. And indeed their losses would probably have been higher had the French cavalry not attacked the Russian positions to the north of the valley, so at least they weren't facing a complete crossfire. The Battle of Balaclava had lasted 6 hours. The casualty figures from both sides amounted to, combined, just over 1,000 men, which compared to the 9,000 at Alma and the 16,000 at the forthcoming Battle of Inkerman, the cost in blood was actually very low. By the end of that morning, the Russians had captured the far redoubts and the heights that separated the two valleys. And despite the valiant charge of the Light Brigade, they'd managed to carry off 7 British cannon too. More importantly, they had cut the main road from the port of Balaclava to the British forces laying siege to Sevastopol. Supplies would now have to be transported up narrow, steep tracks at the western end of the southern valley, which created considerable hardships for the British forces during the forthcoming Russian winter. And don't forget that more British soldiers were to die of disease than from Russian bullets or shells during the Crimean War. But despite that result, Balaclava became one of those glorious, heroic events that forged the spirit of Britain's fighting forces. 3 incredibly courageous actions in a battle that Britain essentially lost. The heroic charges by both the Light Brigade, but equally the Heavy Brigade against superior forces, come what may. But above all, the courageous stand of the 93rd. Whilst the 93rd and their successors, the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, were to be nicknamed the Thin Red Line, their actions seemed in general to epitomise the general attitude of Queen Victoria's red-coated soldiers. Outnumbered, facing hundreds of cavalry and infantryman's nightmare, they calmly refused to form a square, but stood in extended formation. 2 lines deep, they stood coolly, they stood firm, displaying a level of discipline, courage and never-say-die attitude that has become the hallmark of the British Army to this day. The Thin Red Line. Well, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed that. The Crimean War has some incredible stories, and I think I should tell some more. What do you think? Drop me a line in the comments below. Meanwhile, I'm working hard on more stories from British military history for you. So keep well, and I'll see you very soon.